Mr. President, I want to start off by reminding everybody of an old but very short Hans Christian Andersen story about an emperor who was convinced by two very clever weavers that they could make clothes that would be invisible to anybody that was unfit for position or stupid or incompetent. And as a result, everybody thought they could see the clothes, until one little boy said, "The emperor doesn't have any clothes." And then everybody gasped and realized that was the case. Well, we've kind of been weaving a budget through the years that is kind of like the emperor's clothes. We want everybody to be able to see them and think that we are fit and competent and not stupid. Well, as this year quickly draws to a close, we're once again approaching a federal spending deadline that will likely be postponed yet with another temporary spending bill. In the last 40 years, Congress has enacted 175 of these continuing resolutions to avoid doing its job. This will be the 176th continuing resolution since the modern budget process was established. The November election results showed that the American people are eager for change. With a new president taking the oath of office on January 20th, Congress has an opportunity and a responsibility to get back to work. One of our top priorities must be fixing America's broken budget process to provide our nation with a responsible fiscal blueprint and help guide our spending decisions now and into the future. Let me tell you about America's coming fiscal crisis. America is on a course for a fiscal disaster. Sadly, that's not going to surprise many people. We all know the statistics: 20 trillion in debt, on track to grow to 29 trillion in 10 years, unchecked entitlement spending that consumes 70% of the budget, and the imminent return of trillion-dollar deficits. Everyone knows we're in deep trouble. But what's surprising is that Congress is not considering ways to fix it. The country's finances are in a perilous position, and the federal government has refused to act. We pretend to see the clothes. That's because when it comes to spending money, Congress is kind of like a binge eater. We don't want to start our diet until right after the next dessert, and we never seem to run out of ideas for new desserts. That attitude has led to a mammoth, oversized debt burden that will crush future generations' prosperity. The first step to spending within our means is to establish healthy habits. We should stock the fridge with fruits and vegetables, not cake and cookies. Unfortunately, America's broken budget process does the opposite. It makes it easy for Congress to spend and spend without ever checking its fiscal waistline. And Congress never has to consider the fiscally healthy options that would put our budget on a better path. America's looming fiscal crisis actually has its roots in the way America's budget and spending process is laid out. This money funds activities that most people would associate with good government, such as national defense, education, and infrastructure spending. This is the portion of the budget that attracts the most congressional scrutiny. We have limits in place that make it difficult to spend more than what's allotted, and those limits are subject to fierce debate and negotiations every 2 years or so. We also must pass spending bills to fund these government activities every year, forcing a public debate about where taxpayers' dollars should be spent. This portion of the budget is not growing rapidly and is not the cause of our unsustainable fiscal course. The real culprit is the other 70% of the federal budget. This portion is spent automatically without regular congressional action or review. Let me say that again. The real culprit is the other 70% of the federal budget. This portion is spent automatically without regular congressional action or review. In just 15 years, it will consume all government revenues as debt, interest payments, and entitlements continue to grow rapidly. There are no effective limits to the amount that can be spent on that side of the budget, at least until this spending drives America into bankruptcy. This is how the budget process makes it easy to spend money. There is regular review and strict limits on the small and shrinking portion of the budget, the 30%. But the much larger automatic spending programs are not regularly reviewed and can grow almost without limit. Some automatic spending programs have a dedicated but insufficient source of revenue. For example, Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment benefits are funded in part by payroll taxes and insurance premiums. This makes sense. If Congress is not going to regularly review a program, there should at least be a source of funding to ensure the program is sustainable. However, the automatic programs that receive dedicated revenues are grossly underfunded, and many others do not receive any dedicated revenues. That means our government is making promises to pay for these programs, even though they don't have any idea where the money will come from. Let me repeat that. The automatic programs that receive dedicated revenues are grossly underfunded, and many others don't even receive any dedicated revenues. That means our government is making promises to pay for these programs, even though they don't have any idea where the money will come from. This chart gives you a little bit of an idea. The chart shows the dedicated revenues for some of the largest automatic spending programs. For example, Social Security and Medicare are each funded in part with a dedicated payroll tax. However, payroll taxes are less than benefit payments. You see that Social Security's spending gap over the next 10 years is $2 3/10 trillion, or $2,321 billion. Medicare's receipts cover only 54% of spending, leaving a funding gap of $4 $4,365 billion. These annual cash flow deficits grow worse every year of the budget window, and they'll continue to deteriorate at a faster rate outside the budget window as millions of baby boomers continue to retire. Now, I like to phrase this a little bit differently. This is on Social Security, the amount of spending versus the amount of revenue. $12,000 billion in spending, but only $10,000 billion in revenue, which leaves a program deficit of $2,321 billion. It's not being funded by Social Security now. Well, instead of revenue percent of spending, I like to say that we overspent by 18%. And on Medicare, $9,590 billion. That's a lot of money in revenue, in spending, but the revenue is only $5,225 billion. That's a deficit of $4,365 billion. So as revenue as a percent of spending, it's 54%, but it's 46% overspent. 46% overspent. Some people will say that we shouldn't worry about these programs because we collected money from previous generations that will cover the cost of these programs. They say we have trust funds to pay for these programs. But you can't trust these government trust funds. There is no way that the federal government puts away cash to be used later. Instead, they take these deficits, these excesses as they came in past years when we had less baby boomers. That cash was spent in exchange for bonds being put in a drawer. The bonds are with the full faith and trust of the federal government, but it's not real money. In order to spend that, money has to be put in the drawer. Yes, there was a surplus in Social Security, but it was spent. Now, we'll continue to manufacture money to make those payments, but the government has no way to invest money. As an accountant, I can tell you the federal budget operates on a cash basis, and previous Congresses spent that cash as soon as it came in, all the cash. There's no real money socked away to cover these costs. So when it comes time to pay for these programs, the only money the Treasury Department can rely on are these dedicated revenues. As the chart shows, they're not sufficient to cover spending. So the Treasury Department has to take extra money from taxpayers to borrow it in the public debt markets. Overall, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that the government will spend over $35 trillion on automatic spending programs over the next 10 years. But this chart shows that these programs will only collect $15.5 trillion, or $15,538 billion. $15,538 billion. But the spending will be $35,333 billion. So as a percent of spending, that's 44%. Well, actually, that's overspending of 56%. We aren't even taking in half of what we promised. So guess what happens next? The Treasury Department will ask taxpayers and public debt markets for an additional $20 trillion to pay for these programs. That's why America is facing trillion-dollar deficits, overspending. A deficit is another word for overspending. It doesn't sound quite as bad as overspending, but that's why we're facing trillion-dollar overspending amounts in each year. And that's why America's debt's $20 trillion on its way to $29 trillion. It's overspending. Rising interest rates. Let me talk about that. To make matters worse, the historically low interest rates that America pays on its debt are poised to rise, according to the latest signals from the Federal Reserve. That's why we have to do something, and we have to do something now. Incidentally, interest is a mandatory expense. There's no way to avoid it. And it doesn't have any source of revenue other than the general fund. Now, we pay almost 2% interest on our $14 trillion in publicly held debt. That's $14,000 billion. We pay 2% on that. That's roughly $220 billion a year, excluding the share paid to federal revenues, which goes back to the federal budget. But a 2% interest rate is not the norm for our government. When interest rates rise, as they're expected to do in the next few years, the $220 billion could more than triple. That's $700 billion, maybe $800 billion a year spent on only the interest on our nation's debt. That's more than we spend on national defense. That's interest as a mandatory expense with no source of revenue. So what's the bad news and the good news? So this is the bad news, but there is good news too. Both the House Budget Committee under the leadership of Chairman Tom Price and the Senate Budget Committee have been working on solutions that would improve the way Congress considers budget legislation. Over the last year, the Senate Budget Committee has held a series of public hearings with expert witnesses. We've consulted with budget practitioners from both sides of the aisle, and we've sought advice from its former chairman. Members considered all the ideas presented, even entertaining proposals to abolish the Budget Committee if it could be replaced with a better governance structure. This year-long effort demonstrated what successful budget reform should look like. I intend to pursue these reforms at every opportunity and enact as many possible in the coming months. At a minimum, we need to fix budget procedures in the Senate so that the congressional budget is easier to pass and harder to ignore and easier to understand. The budget resolution is the only regular tool that we have that forces Congress to examine all spending and revenues, including automatic spending, over a 10-year period. Unfortunately, the budget resolution has devolved into a purely political exercise, and that's often ignored. The last passed budget was good for about 3 months before waivers overrode the budget. Congress cannot continue to lurch from crisis to crisis without meaningful, long-term budget plans. My reforms would fix congressional budgeting by reducing the political impediments to passing a budget resolution. Budget proceedings would be more orderly and transparent, with less political gotcha amendments that define consideration of a budget resolution here in the Senate. My reforms would also make the budget meaningful by requiring a higher vote threshold for legislation that spends billions of taxpayers' dollars without offsetting it, and offsetting it in a real way. We also need to revise the concepts and rules that determine how we budget and estimate the cost of legislation. These outdated rules haven't been comprehensively reviewed and updated since 1967 and often lead to confusing or inaccurate estimates. A new commission of experts should update our federal budget concepts for the 21st century. We should also create new rules that encourage Congress to consider the annual appropriations measures on time under regular order. The current process has only been completed 4 times in the last 40 years. The last time was 1998, and that's when there was a lot of Social Security extra money to spend. This is a disgrace. Congress should do its job on time and in an orderly fashion. It should not be negotiating a year's worth of spending in the weeks before the holidays like a college student cramming for midterms, or maybe stuffing on spending like everybody is a budget Thanksgiving. One of my proposals borrows an idea from the Wyoming State Legislature. They set a certain number of days every year to consider only budget legislation. If a member wants to consider a non-budget bill, which perhaps would be an emergency, they have to convince 2/3 of their colleagues to agree to take it up without any debate. Otherwise, you stick to the spending. I also will encourage enactment of Senator Portman's bill to end government shutdowns and legislation to move the annual spending process to a biennial cycle so that it does not have to complete all 12 bills each year, and each agency would have 2 years of planning they'd be able to count on. We need a fiscal course correction. So addressing America's long-term debt crisis is a daunting challenge that cannot be left to future generations as it has been in the past. The annual budget process is not designed to force through the serious reforms needed to put America's budget back on a sustainable trajectory, nor should an annual majority-driven process be empowered to do so. That's why former Senators Kent Conrad and Judd Gregg, the former Democrat and Republican Budget Committee chairs, have advocated for a bipartisan task force operating outside the annual budget process to solve the country's long-term fiscal crisis. A BRAC-style commission, similar to what has been introduced by Senator Coates, should be created to set a sustainable long-term fiscal target and recommend policy options to achieve that target. And Congress must take up and consider those recommendations. This institution cannot continue to willfully ignore these serious threats to our country's future prosperity. This is the major issue of our time, and substantive solutions should be considered on the floor of the House and Senate. I know it's only fun to invent and spend on new programs, but Congress has to be the adult in the room. They have to recognize whether their emperor has clothes or not. They can't pretend to see. These bipartisan reforms wouldn't solve all our budget problems, but they are a promising first step towards unsticking the budget gridlock that's gripped Washington in recent years. More importantly, they would create healthy fiscal habits. It would force Congress to recognize and begin to address the daunting fiscal challenges this country faces. This crisis isn't going to go away, and only the members of Congress can fix it. The American people have spoken, and we owe it to them to put this country on a better path. These reforms are a necessary first step, and Congress must enact them as soon as possible.